There is a moment, in a hospital room in Los Angeles, in the early hours of March 23, 2011, that the world knew almost nothing about until it was already over. The woman lying in that bed had been photographed more than almost any human being of the 20th century. Her face had sold magazines by the millions. Her marriages, her jewels, her illnesses, her comebacks, all of it had been public property for nearly 70 years. But in that final hour, there were no photographers in the room. There was no script, no costume, no character to play. There were only 4 people who called her something the rest of the world never quite got to see her as. Not a legend, not an icon, just Mom. Michael, Christopher, Liza, Maria. All 4 of them were there when she died. All 4 of them had been there, in one way or another, for the whole of it. Through 8 marriages, through scandal, through sickness, through the kind of fame that swallows most families whole. And yet, for decades, their story was the one piece of Elizabeth Taylor's life that stayed almost entirely out of frame. This is not the story of Elizabeth Taylor, the movie star. You already know that story. This is the story of Elizabeth Taylor, the mother. The one relationship in her extraordinary, chaotic, dazzling life that she seemed most determined to protect from the very fame that made her. And it matters now more than it has in a long time. For most of her children's lives, they said almost nothing publicly about her. One of her sons did not sit for a television interview about his mother for more than a decade after her death. When he finally did, in 2024, it was treated as a genuine event, the closing of a long silence. Why did it take so long? What were they protecting? And what does it tell us, now that they've finally started to speak, about who Elizabeth Taylor really was behind closed doors? To understand the mother, you have to understand, briefly, how she became one. Because for Elizabeth Taylor, motherhood did not arrive gently, or on schedule, or in any kind of order at all. She was 18 years old when her first son was born. 18. Most young women that age are still trying to figure out who they are. Elizabeth Taylor was already one of the most famous faces on the planet, and now she was also a mother to a boy named Michael Howard Wilding, born in January of 1953, the son of her second husband, the British actor Michael Wilding. 2 years later, in February of 1955, a second son arrived, Christopher. 2 boys, born less than 3 years apart, to a mother barely into her 20s, a mother who was, at the very same time, becoming one of the biggest stars Hollywood had ever produced. It would have been an overwhelming life for anyone. For Elizabeth Taylor, it was compounded by everything that came with her name. There were nannies, there was staff, there was a household built to manage the sheer scale of her fame. And by the accounts of those who studied her life closely, this meant Taylor's relationship with her 2 young sons in those early years leaned less toward strict discipline and more toward warmth, toward friendship. A young mother trying to hold on to something normal in a life that had stopped being normal before she was even a teenager herself. But the story of Elizabeth Taylor's family was never going to stay simple for long. In 1957, her marriage to Michael Wilding ended, and she married the film producer Mike Todd. That same year, she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, whom everyone would come to know as Liza. And then, only months later, tragedy struck in a way that would shape the rest of Liza's childhood before she was even old enough to understand it. Mike Todd was killed in a plane crash in New Mexico in February of 1958 on his way to accept an award. Liza was just 6 months old. She would grow up never knowing the father whose name she carried, raised instead by a mother who was, once again, forced to rebuild a family out of loss. It is worth pausing here, because this is one of those forgotten details that says so much about who Elizabeth Taylor was as a parent. Years later, Richard Burton, the man Taylor would marry not once but twice, formally adopted Liza as his own daughter. In the middle of one of the most talked-about love affairs in Hollywood history, in the middle of scandal and headlines and a media frenzy the likes of which the industry had rarely seen, there was a quieter story unfolding. a stepfather choosing to give a fatherless little girl his name. And then, in 1961, came the child whose adoption may reveal more about Elizabeth Taylor's instincts as a mother than any other single fact in this entire story. A baby girl was born in Munich, Germany, her biological parents never publicly known, and she came into Elizabeth Taylor's life with a congenital hip condition that would require, over the course of her childhood, nearly 24 corrective surgeries. Most people, faced with the option of adopting a healthy child or one who would need years of surgeries and medical care, might have hesitated. According to accounts from that period, Taylor did not. She is said to have responded to the child's condition not with caution, but with a kind of fierce, immediate devotion, reportedly saying that she wanted the little girl all the more because she was ill, that maybe there was something she could do to help. That child became Maria Burton, adopted first during Taylor's marriage to Eddie Fisher and finalized after she married Richard Burton in 1964. 4 children, 2 different fathers by blood, 1 adopted. 2 marriages that ended in divorce, 1 that ended in a fatal plane crash, and 1, Richard Burton, that she would marry, divorce, remarry, and divorce again. By any measure, it was a family built out of upheaval. And yet, when you listen to what her children have said about growing up inside all of that, upheaval is not the word that comes up most. The word that comes up most is protection. There is a phrase that has followed Elizabeth Taylor's family through the decades, spoken by her son Christopher and repeated by those who study her life. "My mother protected us from the circus." That is how Christopher Wilding once described his childhood, not without acknowledging what it cost. He has said in more recent years that being shielded didn't mean they never saw the chaos. Sometimes there was simply no way to avoid it, but the effort, the intention, was always there. Elizabeth Taylor did not push her children into the spotlight, the way some famous parents have been known to do. She did not use their childhoods as material for her own image. Those who have studied her closely describe a woman who was, in her private life, a kind of counterweight to her own fame. Globe-trotting, glamorous, endlessly photographed, and still somehow determined to keep her children's faces out of the story as much as she possibly could. That does not mean they escaped it entirely. No one who grew up as Elizabeth Taylor's child in the 20th century could have. Consider what happened in the early 1960s, when Taylor and Richard Burton fell in love on the set of Cleopatra, while each was still married to someone else. It became, almost overnight, one of the most sensational love stories the modern press had ever covered. A scandal so enormous it reshaped both of their public lives. Christopher Wilding was a child in the middle of it. Decades later, speaking publicly about it for the first time on camera, he would describe what that period felt like from the inside, not with bitterness, but with the plain honesty of someone who lived through something strange and inescapable. He understood, he said, why the attention existed. His mother and Richard Burton were, in his words, a kind of phenomenon, and once the story caught fire, there was no putting it out. It was, he said simply, a drag. A huge drag. There is something almost startling in the plainness of that word, drag, coming from a man who grew up inside one of the most mythologized romances in Hollywood history. It's not a dramatic word, it's a tired one. And that, perhaps, is the most honest window into what it actually felt like to be a child of Elizabeth Taylor. Not glamorous, not thrilling, but exhausting, in a way that never quite let up. He has spoken, too, about crueler moments, about the taunts he endured from classmates at boarding school, about the particular unkindness of children repeating gossip about his mother's personal life back to him, as though it were simply information rather than a wound. When asked, much later, whether he understood why people are drawn to that kind of scrutiny, Christopher offered something close to a final verdict on the whole bargain of fame. That he understood it, having seen it from both sides, but that opening yourself up to that kind of exposure is a deal with the devil that isn't worth making. It's worth remembering that Christopher only shared these memories publicly for the first time in 2024. more than a decade after his mother's death, and only after producers spent a great deal of time earning his trust. For most of his life, he simply didn't talk about it. That silence itself tells you something. It tells you that whatever protection his mother tried to give him as a child, he carried forward into adulthood as his own instinct. The same instinct for privacy that she modeled for him, even while living the most public life imaginable. But if Christopher's story is about privacy hard-won, his brother Michael's story carries a different texture entirely: public duty, and the particular burden of being the eldest child of someone the whole world claimed to know. Michael Wilding Jr. followed his mother into the family business for a time, appearing alongside her in her 1967 film, The Taming of the Shrew, later carving out his own small career on American soap operas through the 1980s. But there was another side to his young adulthood, a restless, searching period that took him first to India and later to England, chasing an ambition to start a rock band, fathering 2 children along the way before eventually settling down and marrying Brooke Palance, daughter of the actor Jack Palance, in 1982. It reads in the accounts that survive less like a rupture with his mother than the ordinary turbulence of a young man trying to find an identity of his own, separate from the shadow he'd been born into. A shadow so large that he once said, plainly, that the only reason anyone wanted to interview him was because of his famous parents, not because of anything he'd actually done. He believed, he said, that would not always be the case. Whatever wandering defined those years, it was Michael who stood, decades later, as the voice of the entire family. When Elizabeth Taylor died in 2011, it was Michael, the firstborn, who delivered the family's statement to the world. And in that statement, you can hear, perhaps more clearly than in any interview, exactly how her children experienced her. Not as an icon, not as 8 marriages and 2 Academy Awards, but as a woman who lived with enormous appetite for life, who loved deeply, and whose absence left an entire family reeling from something they had never quite prepared for, no matter how long they'd had to prepare. There is a small, almost throwaway detail from the Wilding household that somehow captures everything about how Elizabeth Taylor drew the line between her public triumphs and her private family life. As boys, Michael and Christopher were allowed to play with their mother's Golden Globes. Her Oscars, though, were off limits. It's a tiny thing, a household rule, nothing more. And yet it says something almost poetic about how she compartmentalized her own achievements. The Globes were toys, the Oscars were sacred. And when Christopher, as an adult, eventually came into possession of his mother's first Best Actress Oscar, the one she won for Butterfield 8 in 1961, he did not put it in a vault or a museum. He put it on a bookshelf in his living room, where he says, simply, that he is thrilled to have it. A piece of Hollywood history, sitting quietly in a family home, exactly where a son might keep something that belonged to his mother. If Christopher inherited her privacy and Michael inherited her public voice, it was Liza, her only daughter by blood, the fatherless baby who grew into a woman who wanted almost nothing to do with the spotlight, who may have absorbed her mother's example most completely, by doing the opposite of everything her mother's life represented. Liza grew up, in part, on movie sets. William J. Mann, who spent years researching Taylor's life, has described how, during the filming of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, Elizabeth kept her young daughter close by, on set, often at her side. It's an image worth sitting with. The most famous actress in the world, in the middle of one of the most demanding performances of her career, keeping her little girl nearby rather than at a distance. It suggests a woman trying to hold both halves of her life together at once, rather than choosing between them.
And yet, whatever Liza absorbed from watching her mother work, it clearly wasn't a desire to follow her onto a soundstage. There is a moment, small and almost funny, and yet somehow one of the most revealing exchanges in this entire story, when a reporter from a British newspaper approached the young Liza at a school event and asked whether she planned to become an actress like her mother. Her answer needed no elaboration. "An actress?" she said. Two words. And in them, an entire childhood's worth of watching the cost of fame up close and wanting no part of it. Liza studied art in London and Los Angeles, and by the late 1970s had found her calling as a sculptor, working first in bronze, drawn to horses, later turning her attention to African wildlife and elephant conservation. She built a life on a farm in New York's Hudson Valley, married, raised two sons, and by every account chose a life defined by privacy so complete that even her neighbors, when asked about her, are reluctant to say much, not out of secrecy, but out of respect for a woman who has clearly earned the quiet she sought. It is, in its way, one of the more remarkable outcomes of this entire story. The daughter of the most photographed woman of her generation, living a life that photographs almost never find. And there is one more detail, passed down not from Liza, but from her own son, that closes this part of the story with unexpected tenderness. Quinn Tivey, Elizabeth Taylor's grandson, has spoken not of a legend, but of a grandmother he would simply watch movies with, in bed, an ordinary domestic memory, utterly unremarkable, except for whose grandmother it belonged to. It is, perhaps, the most convincing evidence in this whole story that whatever else Elizabeth Taylor was to the world, to her own family she managed, at least sometimes, to just be family. That instinct to protect, the same instinct Christopher described as shielding them from the circus, did not end when her children became adults. If anything, it seems to have grown fiercer. By the year 2000, Maria Burton, the daughter adopted as a small, ailing child, the one Taylor reportedly wanted all the more because she was ill, was a grown woman with a marriage falling apart. Her husband, Steve Carson, with whom she'd built both a family and a talent agency, became embroiled in a bitter and very public dispute with her, one that included accusations that Maria had moved their young daughter away without his knowledge and disputes over shared finances. Carson, for his part, publicly accused his famous mother-in-law of using her influence and her fame to tip the scales against him. Whatever the full truth of that painful chapter, and it is worth being honest that accounts of it involve claims from both sides that were never fully resolved in public, one thing about it is not in dispute. Elizabeth Taylor did not stay on the sidelines. William J. Mann, who studied the family closely, put it plainly. Elizabeth became the mother hen when those kids were threatened. She took her daughter's side, and she absorbed the criticism that came with it without hesitation. It is a small but telling coda to everything else in this story. The same woman who, as a teenage mother, learned to be more friend than disciplinarian to her sons. The same woman who kept a fatherless infant close and turned an ailing adopted daughter into one of the most protected people in her life. The same woman who tried, however imperfectly, to keep her children's names out of the same headlines that made her own name a household word. That woman, even in her late 60s, was still willing to stand in the middle of a storm for one of her children. Motherhood for Elizabeth Taylor was never something she retired from. It simply changed shape as her children grew. And then, in the final weeks of her life, it came full circle. In early 2011, Elizabeth Taylor was admitted to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, being treated for congestive heart failure, a condition she had lived with on and off for years. For 6 weeks, her family waited, hoped, and watched her condition rise and fall. And in the early hours of March 23rd, with her 4 children gathered around her, she died. She was 79 years old. There is something quietly extraordinary in that single fact. Not the death itself, which comes for everyone, but the detail that all 4 of her children were there. Not 1, not 2, but Michael, Christopher, Liza, and Maria, all in the room at the end. For a woman whose life had been defined, again and again, by chaos and change, 8 marriages, constant public scrutiny, decades of headlines, the very last thing she experienced was something steady, something whole. Her family, together, exactly as she had spent 79 years trying, in her own complicated way, to hold them. 2 days later, a private funeral was held at Forest Lawn Memorial Park, attended by roughly 4 dozen family members and close friends. And even in her final arrangements, something of Elizabeth Taylor's spirit came through in a way that made her family, and later the public, smile through their grief. She had left instructions asking that the service begin 15 minutes behind schedule, and that someone announce before it began that she had wanted to be late even for her own funeral. It was such a precisely her kind of joke, glamorous, self-aware, impossible not to love, that it feels less like an epitaph and more like one final performance, offered as a gift to the people who knew her best. During that hour-long service, the actor Colin Farrell read poetry alongside members of her family. One of her grandsons played Amazing Grace on the trumpet. Her casket, draped in gardenias, violets, and lilies of the valley, was carried into the cemetery's great mausoleum, beneath a marble angel, not far from where her friend Michael Jackson had been laid to rest 2 years earlier. It was, by every account, a quiet, dignified goodbye. A stark contrast to the 60 years of flashbulbs that had followed her everywhere else. In the years since, her children and grandchildren have carried her memory forward, but almost never in the way the public might have expected. There has been no rush to cash in, no parade of tell-all interviews. If anything, the defining pattern has been restraint. The same instinct for privacy Taylor tried to instill in them from the very beginning, now guiding how they choose to remember her. That is what makes it so meaningful that, more than a decade after her passing, Christopher Wilding finally agreed to sit for his first television interview about his mother in a documentary released around what would have been her 92nd birthday. By the account of the producers who spent months earning his trust before he agreed to appear on camera, it wasn't an easy decision for him. He had, by his own description, always been shy about discussing his mother's legacy publicly, and yet he chose to do it. Not for attention, but it seems because enough time had finally passed that he felt ready to let the world see a little more of who she had been to him. His niece, Naomi Wilding, and his mother's other grandchildren have, in their own ways, done the same, stepping forward not to relitigate old scandals, but to offer small, human memories. A grandmother who insisted family came first, a woman who would climb into bed and simply watch movies with her grandson, the same way any grandmother might, anywhere in the world. And perhaps that is the truest legacy Elizabeth Taylor left behind. Not the films, extraordinary as they were, and not even the causes she championed in her later years, when she became one of the most tireless and unlikely advocates in the fight against HIV and AIDS, using the very fame she'd spent a lifetime trying to shield her children from in order to protect countless people she would never meet. Her legacy, in the end, is a family that, against every possible odd fame could throw at them, largely turned out all right. 4 children who, by their own accounts and their own choices, grew into adults who valued privacy over exposure, love over spectacle, and one another over everything the world assumed mattered most about their mother's life. It would have been easy, perhaps even understandable, for the children of Elizabeth Taylor to have turned out broken by all of it. The marriages, the scandals, the relentless cameras, the sheer unmanageable size of her fame. Instead, What the record actually shows is something quieter and, in its own way, far more remarkable. A mother who, whatever chaos surrounded her, kept trying, through nannies and film sets and divorces and a death in a plane crash and a hip surgery after hip surgery, to give her children something steadier than the life she herself was living. A circus kept as much as humanly possible at the door. Maybe that is the real story hiding behind 70 years of headlines. Not the diamonds, not the husbands, not even the films that made her immortal on screen, but a woman who, when the cameras finally stopped and the lights finally dimmed, was surrounded not by an audience, but by her children. The 4 people who, more than anyone else on earth, had actually known her. And in the end, isn't that the story every family hopes will be told about them? Not how famous we were, not how much the world watched, but who was there, at the very last, holding our hand? For Elizabeth Taylor, the answer was simple. It was Michael. It was Christopher. It was Liza. It was Maria. It was, after everything, family.